So good to see all of you. I'm so glad that you have this passion for God and His Word and how the world supports the Bible as being true. You don't hear that around in our culture very much, so it's wonderful to see people who are interested in learning about that. So I've been active in this kind of thing for a while now. When I lived in Wheaton, up to about 6 years ago, I and some other people started the Midwest Creation Fellowship. And we had Bruce there and a number of other people, but it was a good group to get started there. Chicago is such a big place. People said you can never have a creation group in Chicago. People will drive 50 miles from one end to the other to go to a group. So what we decided to do is divide the city up into areas, a northern area, a southern area, and a western area, and I started one in the west. They finally had one in the north and the south going, so we were getting Chicago covered. Really grateful for that. So let's get going here. What are the created kinds? The Bible talks about the kinds. We'll see different verses that has that a little bit later. Man, that thing's big. I have to sit next to you. So here's me, Portland State University, Portland, Oregon, where I got my bachelor's degree. Then I moved across the country to New Jersey, went to school at New York University, to the Cron Institute of Mathematical Sciences, and got my master's in math there. Well, I'm a systems engineer. Here's some of the things that I did. I worked at Bell Telephone Laboratories, and I met some of other people here who've been from Bell Labs. And so at Bell Labs, I worked in space and aeronautical kinds of studies. We were simulating hostile Russian launches to targets in the United States to see how well we could defend against them. This was back in the Cold War days when this was real stuff. And so I got tired of targeting places like North Dakota and began targeting places like Alice Springs, Australia. I figured there's nobody there, no one would get hurt anyway, so Alice Springs was like a good place to target. So then after the military work, I worked for Ameritech, Illinois, Bell, and several other, Wisconsin included, joined together and became Ameritech. So I was in Illinois Bell at the time I turned to Ameritech. And after I retired from Ameritech, I went to a manufacturer called Tellabs. And so I did a lot of interesting things there. One of the things I did was domestic and international telecommunications standards. So I would meet with representatives of other companies in America to develop American standards, and we would go to usually Geneva, Switzerland, where we'd meet with representatives from various countries around the world, where we created world standards for telecommunications. That was really a lot of fun. And you get together and it's like a family reunion every 3 months or something like that. And you get to work on really interesting technical things. So that's a little bit about me. During the time I was at Ameritech, I was elected senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. You probably have, maybe you've heard of the IEEE. That's a premier engineering and professional society. Excuse me. And so I was a member of that, and you have to be elected to become a senior member. You can't just sign up for that. So I was elected there. So my passion is really about knowing God through the Bible and science. Let me back and look over here. Knowing God through the Bible and science. And when I was in Wheaton, we started the Midwest Creation Fellowship, as I said. And up in the North Country, we started Northwoods Creation Association. Several churches got together, and we got that going. So this is just the front of our web page. So what a surprise. We'll get into the talk now. What a surprise. In June of 2007, USA Today and Gallup had a poll. And here's the poll. They made this statement: creationism, that is the idea that God created human beings pretty much in their present form at one time within the last 10,000 years. And people asked, was this statement true? Or is it probably true? Or is it false? And the surprising thing was that 66% says either true or probably true. That was really amazing to me. So now they ask another question in the same poll. Evolution, that is the idea that human beings developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life. So they ask the same question: is this true or probably true? 53% said that was true or probably true. So some people believe both creation and evolution. 66% believe in creation, 53% believe in evolution. Some must believe in both. Gallup doesn't know why. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask the question, what is evolution? And then get into the meat of the talk, what are the created kinds? Did God create the species? Is natural selection true? And how many animals were on the ark? And how do you determine the created kinds? So I've read maybe 5 or 6 different definitions for evolution. The 2 main ones that I'll look at here is adaptation of populations to new environments. They're still the same body type. We'll see examples of this. And then common descent of all life on Earth from a single ancestor. So the first one is often called microevolution, and the second one is called macroevolution. The second one involves a change from one body type to another. It'll be completely different. So like fish may develop legs and crawl out on the land. That would be macroevolution. It's not microevolution. So just for information, some evolutionists define macroevolution as change from one species to another because they see it, and that way they can say the word makes sense. So let's look at adaptation, an example. Changes in a life form induced by changing environment. The basic body type is unchanged. So what you see is you would have a reptile. He's kind of grayish. He lives maybe in darker rocks, and some of them move over to lighter rock, maybe like tan rocks. And over a period of time, as these guys have offspring, some of them will be light and some will be dark. The ones that move over here onto the rocks that this guy's on, the light ones will survive, the dark ones will stand out against the rocks, and so they'll be eaten by predators. So the ones that survive are the ones that are different from the first one. So even though it looks like, they call it evolution, even though there's no actual change in any individual organism. It's a change in the population. So then some of them, the smaller ones, find cracks that they can get into and they survive. The larger ones are still left out in the open, and so they're vulnerable to prey as well. So in this case, you'll see some becoming smaller because of their environment. Because not that the environment changes them, but the ones who best fit in that environment are more likely to survive. The ones who can find the cracks and squeeze in will survive. The ones who are left on top are vulnerable. And so then you can also get, they may move to an island or something, like get on a log and drift out, these smaller guys, and get out when there's a bigger space, and maybe there's no predators and the bigger ones can survive. If they're really susceptible to what their predators are and who survives and who doesn't. So adaptation has always occurred. That's nothing new. Evolutionists haven't invented anything here. Scientists continue to find evolution at work today, and this is a quote from the Field Museum, their website. Evolution still works today. Among contemporary species, examples are changes over time in dog breeds and even in us. So as we change, I don't know, people tend to be getting larger because of our diet. And so they would consider that evolution. We're a lot taller than the people were in the early years of our country. And so, yeah, I was someplace where they have houses, a village of buildings, houses and all from the early American days. The interesting thing was the beds were enclosed, we had curtains around them. I could only fit in about this from my feet up to here because the beds were so short. People have become so much taller since the early days of our country. So what kind of evolution is changes in time of dog species? Adaptation or common descent? Adaptation, yeah. They're just adapting, they're not really changing in any way. So we'll start out with an original finch pair to give an example of how this works. And they would have come from South America and either been blown or flown out to the Galapagos Islands. And they moved to different islands. The islands are different. Some are really dry and deserty, others have more plants and more seeds. Some have large seeds, some have small seeds. So different finches thrives on different islands in different ways. So you have the different kinds that work better on different islands. So same kind of thing happened. You had an original human pair, and then as they spread out over the world, then we had the different people groups. So what kind of changes were those? Adaptation or common descent? Again, this was adaptation, is because of the different climates that they lived in. So now what evolutionary sciences do is they extrapolate from small changes to large changes. So going back to our, this is adaptation, what we've always seen. But now you have, they say that the reptiles evolved into birds. And so they have transitionals. You get changes in the tail that gradually develop feathers. And then the wing changes so that it has wings and the legs change. So you're no longer walking on four legs, you're just walking on the front two. So this is common descent. They're all descending from the reptiles. And they actually changed their body type there. So what we're not told is what we're told here by Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of the branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, but not the evidence of fossils. So we see all of these different trees in the books or in the museums that show how you start with one pair of something and then they spread out and become a lot of different things. Notice he didn't say that transitional species are non-existent. He said they're not as frequent as we would like. Some are particularly impressive. So one of them is Archaeopteryx. You've heard of Archaeopteryx? Supposedly the transitional species between reptiles and birds, or dinosaurs and birds. So here are some features that make them say Archaeopteryx is a bird. The feathers and wings and his feet and wishbone. But in science, this article says Archaeopteryx probably cannot tell us much about the early origin of feathers and flight in true proto-birds because the Archaeopteryx was in a modern sense a bird. So we see adaptation, but we don't see common descent in the birds. Boom, not there. So now what are the created kinds? So here's an evolutionary tree, and we have different life forms at the end of each of these trees. This one would have dogs, and these are earthworms, different kinds of worms. You come out this branch, you end up with reptiles, a Come on, here you get birds, and here you get people, and different aquatic critters. So, examples, where Stephen Gould said examples are only at the nodes and tips of the branches. So let's select, he says the rest is inference. So let's select all the inference and cut it out, shall we? It's gone. Now we have all of these, the tips and nodes. Let's flatten it down, and what do we get? You get the creation orchard. Okay? So now, each tree represents a related group of life forms, the same kind of organism. So that gives you a first glimpse of what we're using the word kind for. So this branch would represent a single-celled organism. This tree would represent the earthworms and other kinds of worms. This would be the dogs and so on. Each one is a related group. They're all related. And they're all from the same tree. So God created kinds of plants in day 3. God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the 3rd day. So you think God wanted us to get the notion that the different kinds of animals were created? He repeated it 3 different times for the different kinds of life forms. Something that we need to pay attention to when he repeats it 3 times, right? 3 is an important number. So the word baramin means created kind. So baraminology is the study of created kinds. So on day 6 was the creation of animals, and God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Do you think he wants to make a point here? How could he make it any more strongly than he did? It really works to get that across. So what is the created kind? Created kind is the original forms of life as they were created by God, and they only produced in their own kind. Within the limits of pre-programmed information, their genes keep fish from becoming land animals. So fish can reproduce within the kind, the fish kind, and land animals reproduce only within their own kinds, their individual kinds. But there's great potential variation within them because of the way God created the genome. So we'll get some examples of created kinds. This is the feline kind. You start with an originally created pair of felines, and then they would, over time, their offspring would become lions and house cats and jaguars and cheetahs. But they all start with the original pair that God created in the Garden of Eden. Does that make sense? Isn't that wonderful? Really remarkable. God created an original pair of felines on day 6. Their genomes contain the potential to produce all the species of felines that we see today. The Canidae kind. So these are the different dogs and wolves and possums and stuff like that. I think all those pictures. So their genes are expressed in fur as either gray or red. Again, that's determined by the genes as they were created. The genes express tails as being bushy or not bushy. So it's all in their genome to make them appear the way they are. And then you have the horses, equidae. You see pintos and zebras, and you see burros, all the variety. Astray kind. Today over 1,800 species of asters have been identified, all these different colors. The weevil kind, God must really love these because there are 86,100 species of weevils around the world. You would want to create a lot of what you really love. So show respect to any weevils you find in your flower. Okay, did God create the species? Just recently I heard someone say that God created all the species and they stay the same. This is an idea that persists to today. Carl Linnaeus, who lived in the 1700s, he laid the foundation for modern biological science. Did really, really important work in categorizing life forms. He believed that God created all species and they remained unchanged. And that's what he taught, and the church picked it up and taught it. And the church was discredited when biologists came along and they showed the species can change over time. The church was discredited because they were wrong in their description of the world. And so, God created different kinds, not the different species. You don't find the word species in the Bible. So is natural selection true? Natural selection is a process whereby organisms which are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. We saw a little bit of that with our examples of the reptiles, right? Here's another example, an interesting example. There's two pools here, two pools of water. One is down, I can't find the pointer, there it is. There's a lower pool and an upper pool separated by a waterfall. That's not the exact one, that's the one I found somewhere. Anyway, in the lower pool, large and small guppies lived. And there were predators for the large ones, so small ones tended to survive. Some of the guppies from the smaller pool, which would be some large and some small ones, were transported up to the upper pool. And there were predators for small fish, and the guppies became large. They had fewer offspring that were larger. And there was no interbreeding between the larger and the smaller ones. And so what happened was, there was speciation that occurred. Now, fossil analysis and the biologists expect it would take 10,000 to 10 million times longer for speciation to occur, but yet it only occurred in 4 years. Happened really fast. What happened was in the upper pool, there was a loss of DNA for small offspring as the large ones were eaten and the only ones that were left were the small. The only DNA that were in the offspring was the DNA for small ones. And so they lost the ability to have large, but they were still guppies, right? Here we have a clear example of what was called evolution. And evolution occurred, but they were still guppies. They didn't change into something else. Natural selection works only within a kind. It does not change organisms from one kind to another. So now, how many animals were on the ark? So I just saw an article by an atheist, and he said there had to be 30 million species on the ark. And then based on that, he debunked the whole ark story. So what do we say to that? Oh, I put that in there. So 30 million plus species estimated to exist today. This is his quote. The 30 million plus species estimated to exist today could not have fit, let alone survived on any plausible boat. So there's no boat big enough to hold 30 million species. That's probably true if you assume we're talking about species. And he goes on to say the dimensions of the ark given and accepted by creationists, plus a further hard limit on the size and scale of the boat creationists can work with. If you look at the dimensions of the ark and how big it is, he's saying if that's the size of the ark, you can't get 30 million species in there, which was okay, we'll agree with that. The modern invention of baramins, which is what we'll be talking about, is thus intended to allow for a scriptural reading which reduces the number of animals Noah would have to care for on the absolutely farcical to the merely highly implausible number of species. Anyways, he writes well, you have to say that for him, right? But he's saying it can't be true because of the size of the ark and the number of species they're talking about. Well, let's talk about the size of the ark. How many of you have been to the Ark Encounter? Ooh, quite a few. Yeah, it's a wonderful place. So, 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet high. It's a big thing. Could hold all the kinds of animals. The word species wasn't used until like the 19th century. The Bible uses the word kind, as we said. And there are two of every kind, not species. We had to beat that in there. There were land and air-breathing vertebrates. That would include today's birds, today's mammals, today's reptiles, things that live on the land, and extinct counterparts. We'll get an example of an extinct counterpart in a minute. And they all have been juvenile animals. You wouldn't have had any dinosaurs that weighed 50 tons in the ark. So here's some fossils. They're currently extinct kinds. That would be currently extinct kinds of ceratopsia. So all of these different species of ceratopsia would have existed before the flood, but the only one that existed after the flood that we find in fossils is the Triceratops. So this is probably the only one of all these different species of Triceratops that made it on the ark. God would have brought that one to enter the ark, and the others would have been left to perish outside the ark. It's too bad some are really cute, aren't they? And that one would have been on there. So here we are. So what critics do is they count the number of species that exist today. That one article I saw said 30 million. Sometimes they include animals that are fully aquatic. I don't think aquatic animals needed to be on the ark. They assume adult animals. For example, Brachiosaurus at 50 ton apiece. This is an article by Gene Lichter. So how many kinds were in the ark? There's an article on creation.com. They said about 8,000 kinds, or about 16,000 animals. That's a lot different from 30 million. And that's something that's more believable, right? So, could the ark hold everything? Now that's a fairly complicated question. The answer is complicated. There's this book, I couldn't find my copy of it. I may have left it at a talk I gave like this one. Noah's Ark, a feasibility study by a guy named John Woodmarappy. It's a very thorough book, and if you're at all technically inclined, you'll be fascinated by it. There are about 75 pages of references in the back. It'll do things, for example, could you be hauling lines and all these things in the ark? He goes in and looks at stories of the Greco-Roman times when they were going to Africa and finding lions and tigers and bringing them to Rome so gladiators could fight with them. And described how that was done and how they fed them and how they cared for them on those trips. They said Noah could have done that kind of thing too. Anyways, I found it very fascinating to read this book. If you can get it, I don't know if it's still available or not, but I found it really interesting. So anyway, remember, he makes a point, these points. There are less than 16,000 juvenile animals. Animals would occupy less than 50% of the floor space, so that's 6 to 12% volume of ark would contain food for animals. So let's say 10% as an average. 10% volume of the ark would be used for water. So we're at 50, 60, 70% volume of the ark. That leaves 30% of the ark, which is that huge building for Noah and his family. Oh, you're going to have a gymnasium there, right? A lot of room for exercise. If you've been to the Ark Encounter, you may remember the room that shows what one of their bedrooms would look like. It was really pretty comfortable, it looked like to me. So how do you determine the created kinds? The created kinds are organisms that are defined by creation biology. That's important in creation biology. Evolutionists would never refer to created kinds because they don't believe in created kinds. And those are organisms that share a common ancestry. It refers to the Genesis account of creation week, during which God created many kinds of plants and animals. So you look at something, you ask what kind is it, you would go back to creation week and find out what that particular, its ancestors would have looked like. How do you know the members of a created kind? Well, for one thing, can they interbreed? Created kinds should be able to interbreed. There's examples, and you look at similarity. They should look similar if they have the same ancestors. And they can measure similarity statistically. We'll look at these in a little bit more detail. So here's an example of a liger. There was a lion father and a tiger mother. And so you see characteristics of both the father and the mother. They call it a liger. And also Tyons, which would be a tiger father and a lion mother. And you still get something similar to this because they're going to have the characteristics of both lions and tigers. So if they can interbreed, they're probably in the same kind. So you can also just look. If they look really similar, then probably they came from the same ancestors. You look at so what are some of the points of similarity between these? Horns. They're in the same place, the same shape, not the same size. What?
The nose.
The nose looks very similar, doesn't it? How about the ears? They're both on the side, high in the back of the head. And the backs are straight.
Grass eating.
Grass eating, they're not doing it there, but yeah, that's true. Anyway, you just look at them, you see that they're very similar. It would not be unreasonable to say that they had common ancestors. So now, how about, what if you compare the DNA of the two? If they have common ancestors, will their DNA reveal that?
Yes.
You would think so, wouldn't you? So, this is the DNA Discovery Center in the Field Museum of Natural History. I spent a lot of time there when I lived in Wheaton. Interesting place. One of the things you can do is between 11 and 12, I think it is, weekdays, they have an open mic and you can talk to the researchers back there. So I asked them one time, using DNA, can you create an evolutionary tree so you know what it's descended from what? And they said, yes, you can. And here's what they showed us. Well, this is a cladogram. This is what you get if you just look at things. And this is the DNA tree. So here you have the falcon and the hawk. They would have a common ancestor, but be very, very recent, because they both have beaks that are similar, because they tear meat, and they'd be made for fast flight, diving and catching prey. And the songbird is so very, very different. You know, its feet would be very different. It's for perching on trees rather than grasping, struggling prey. And the beaks are for pecking on seeds, things like that. But now if you go to the DNA tree, this is what the DNA tells you. It tells you the songbird and the falcon are closely related. And then they don't join the hawk until they have a much more distant ancestor. So if you look at the DNA, you can get something very different from what you get if you look at it from just a reasonable observational perspective. So I thought, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, that makes it really tough for the evolutionists, but it makes it tough for us too. Because we wanted to develop these different trees too to show how things are related from creation. Just have a different perspective. But we have the same problem with the cladogram and the DNA tree, knowing which ones are related. So why don't you just compare the genome? Well, the genomes of most organisms have not yet been sequenced. So you can't really compare those if you don't have it. It is useful for bacteria because their genomes are smaller. Other genomes are too large. Now, here's a new word, holobaramin. You heard baramin before, right? It's the created kind. Holobaramin means the whole created kind. So everything that goes in a single created kind. A grouping that contains all organisms related by descent. That is, they share common ancestors. So again, we have these, they would have a common ancestor, they would be related by descent. Now, you can then look at all the characteristics and then statistically compare similarity and dissimilarity to give a better idea of how similar they are, how close they are. So this is an example of the statistical analysis that can be done using penguins. The space here represents the different characteristics of organisms, and they have complex programs that used to do this, but they will look at each of these and they look at different characteristics and ask, is it here or is it not here? And then they can plug it into the program and it'll, depends on, see this one has a lot of things that are not or are present that are a lot different from this one because its dots are a long ways away from those. These are close and these are really close to each other but still pretty far from there. Space here indicates if it's possible for them to be related or not. These are right next to each other, they could well be related, but this one and that one are so far apart, probably not. So over here we have the puffins on the same chart. And they plotted, each of these represents a different animal, a different bird. They're close to each other, so they would be the same created kind, but they're different kinds from the penguins because they're so far apart. So that way you can use the characteristics of the organisms and plot them on a chart and see it, and then graphically and visually you can see if they would have had, likely have had common ancestors or not. So you identify distinct character traits, you analyze them by a statistical program, and the output is a similarity and dissimilarity of the two organisms. And then you plot them and examine them like we did here. The puffins, all of theirs are a long ways away, and so it's definitely dissimilar. You can look at it and you can see some of it, but this quantifies the differences. You can look at this head and the beak and say this one. And there's some similarity, but they're not the same. You do the same thing with humans. Okay, these are with fossil humans. Down here you have a collection of 4, and they all group into a group they call them Homo sapiens, okay? Up here there are 3, and they are, Homo sapiens and gorillas are over there. But you see there's nothing, there are no examples that are between them. If we had fossils of transitional species, they should appear right in here, right? You should have the gorillas over here, and then you have a transitional one another way here, and another transitional, and pretty soon you get to the Homo sapiens. They're not there. So that helps us to argue that there is no connection between the gorillas and the human, the Homo sapiens. So if 2 different life forms, different organisms, or different families, they will not be in the same family if they were created on different days from a biblical perspective. Like the whale was created on day 5 and Pachycetus on day 6. Pachycetus, you may recall, is thought to be a descendant, an ancestor of the whales. And so they should have been created on the same day. So there's a group called the Creation Biology Society. It consists of biologists and other researchers. Their job is to develop a young age creation model of biological origins. This year's annual meeting was in July. I think they have it at the end of July every year. And I don't know where it was, but if you're interested, I did go to this meeting one time. It's really fascinating to hear the people talk, because they were on the cutting edge of doing this kind of thing. some of the stuff I use came from some of those people. So it's really an interesting, I found it very interesting. So in summary, we've seen what is evolution, what are the created kinds. God did not create the species, even though you sometimes hear it today that God created the species and they remain unchanged. It's not true. He created the different kinds. Natural selection is true, and there were not 30 million animals on the ark. There were, what was it? I forgot the number. 8,000. Yeah. Yeah, 16,000. And we're talking about being determined the created kinds by what they look like, and you can mathematically describe what they look like by looking at individual characteristics and running into this computer fancy program they have. So, here are 3 more questions here. Yes.
On that diagram that you had of the dots, the green dots and blue dots,
Yeah?
you had a circle and you said Homo sapiens, but just said Homo up there.
Yeah, it's just hobo is what it should have been.
What was the 4 dots? I mean, why not 5 or why not 3? What were the 4 dots significant?
It's the ones this particular technical paper chose to use. I don't know why they chose those and not any of the other
Were those
ones.
supposed to represent certain species of Homo, the genus Homo?
I think they were
Oh.
specific species that individually found that they classified as Homo and they plotted them. Good question.
If what you said about God did not create the species, but only the kinds, if God did not create the species that have been created or reportedly are being created, who created them? Or who is creating them?
Well, they weren't created separately. They descended from the different kinds that were created. So there would have been a dog kind that would have been created at creation week, and there would have been one of those that got onto the ark, and as it had offspring, that's where today's dogs came from. They would have had ancestors that were on the ark or were created, and God created them on creation week.
So when Adam and Eve and their kids were walking around there, are you saying that all they would have ever seen was some kind of a proto-cat or proto-feline? They didn't see a leopard or a lion or a domestic?
That's most likely true. I didn't tell you about flowers.
Interestingly, there's artwork and mummified remains of domestic cats and artwork in ancient Egypt, which is older than the supposed age of the Noah's flood. Did you know that?
No.
Oh, well now you do.
Does that change anything?
So yeah, what you just said, it changed. So there were the proto-cats then did evolve before the flood?
Oh, sure.
Oh, okay, well I
Remember the Triceratops? Had all those different species of Triceratops that existed before the flood, but only one of them would have gotten on the flood.
just one had the ticket and then the others.
God made a choice. It said God brought the animals. He picked the ones that would give them the best chance of survival. And then after the flood, the world changed so much that the one that made it on the ark wasn't able to survive in the new world.
Maybe another Triceratops might have survived.
Well, that's speculation. That's maybe interesting speculation.
Are there any kinds that would look similar that are not, like just visually glancing at them, they go, oh, that's similar, and there would be, I would, as a layman, lump them into the same kind, but they actually aren't?
I suppose it's possible.
I had a comment on that gentleman's question about Egypt. If it's true that some of those animals were around before the flood, we have to assume that during that time, before the flood, there was a lot of adaptation. You know, maybe there were chihuahuas in some place or something like that. and then God chose one dog, and then, you know, they could have adapted again and become Chihuahuas again.
Sure.
So could I just clarify?
Sure.
So from your 8,000 kinds,
They were on the ark.
right, 8,000 kinds, that then today there's approximately 1.9 million species that have been described, and undoubtedly more, some estimates up to 8 million. So from 8,000 to millions in just a few thousand years. Wow, that's macroevolution really fast.
A lot of those are
Cool.
bugs, a lot of those are fish, keep that in mind.
No, no, no,
That's
different
microevolution
species.
because within a species, you're not changing
But
lines.
only mammals were.
There were how many mammals, do you think?
Well, when you're
What-
saying
what-
there's,
I'm not understanding his question.
Do you understand that? Do you want to comment?
when
Stand
you
up
say
to-
there's millions of species, a lot of those are insects, a lot of those are fish.
Undoubtedly.
Right, and those weren't on the ark. The insects
Oh,
and the
there-
fish
Yeah,
weren't.
so the bugs,
They probably grabbed hold of brush that was floating on the top of the
they're on
water.
the floating mats for you,
Right, well,
Gotcha.
it says the breath of life was in the,
and that's not true in some places and true in some other places in Genesis, because it does say, in my Bible anyway, that anything outside the ark died.
With nephesh.
It says that in a couple places, but in a couple places it specifically says nothing about breath of life. But they didn't understand about what made something alive. They didn't even think of bugs as alive.
I
In those
guess,
days.
I don't know if that's true or not.
A lot of insects can remain dormant in the water too for long, long times and survive.
Try it sometime. Try it sometime.
Anything else?
Wasn't the ark just having little air-breathing land animals? That's all that was on the
I
ark.
think probably. Julie says yes, she's our resident expert.
Yes, just land-breathing animals that had the breath of life in their nostrils. So as far as with the insects, they didn't have to make those little cages. Insects breathe through tubes in their body, and so it'd be animals like, you know, the land animals, but not aquatic. You know, there was ocean there for them to be swimming in, so no one didn't have to make aquariums.
I just wanted to make the comment that adaptation in animals and smaller creatures happens much more quickly because their lifespan is so much quicker and they mature so much quicker. You know, we kind of look at ourselves sometimes and think there isn't that, because we have a longer lifespan and we mature slower, so, but in the very small creatures like mice or something like that that only lives maybe a couple of years, adaptation happens much more quickly.
Thank you.
And your example there showed it was 5 years for those guppies.
4.
4 years, yeah. So going from how many were on the ark to the speciation could happen very quickly. It's been thousands of
If
years.
guppies were there.
Excuse me, what did you say?
Guppies weren't on the ark, you know,
Right,
of
but I
course.
mean, like, that's the example, but that's the adaptation for all the land animals, then the insects.
If you go to a place like ICR.org or creation.com and type in rapid speciation, you'll find a lot of examples of places like mice that were taken from one city to another one, and they adapted to, and they were different than they were from where they came from, their offspring were. And it would happen quickly.
So did all of the kind of dogs that are in existence today?
I'm sorry?
All of the dogs,
Dogs,
were, you
yeah.
know, wild or domesticated, all dogs, collies, poodles, and so forth, German shepherds, those all descended from one pair of kind?
That's what I believe.
Female kind, yeah.
Yeah, actually, the number of species we have now is very large compared to what they had just 100 or 200 years ago. They result from intensive breeding of humans who are breeding for certain specific characteristics. And so that's why we have so many different species of dogs.
Breeds, you mean.
Breeds, yeah, right. Thank you for the correction.
Does anybody ever wonder, like, how do you get a hippo to go where it don't wanna go?
Like on land?
Just, I know, I mean, so somehow that hippo, because they're a separate family, there's two species living. The separate family, a proto-hippo is gonna be just happily going on to an ark and
I think that we believe that God directed these animals.
God took care of it.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's what Genesis says. God brought the animals to the ark.
A waste of time. Haven't survived.
Yeah, let's go.